All right, thanks everybody for coming. I'm excited to talk more about native plants and specifically talking about how to design with them and how to use native plants in a small urban setting. So many people think native plants are too big, they're too crazy for my small urban plot, and that is completely not true. And hopefully you'll be inspired by this presentation to start working on your own landscape, no matter what size property you have, and you buy some plugs and some plants from the native plant sale that's coming up this month. So I'm going to jump right into it here. So I'm first going to talk a little bit about the design process and how to pick the correct plants for your property. So the first thing you want to kind of do is think about, what's going on in your property. What are the existing conditions that you have? What habitats would you maybe want to recreate? What do you want to attract? Are you really into birding, butterflies? All those things, and all those will be solved by using native plants. And then you can start looking into more specifics to select those native plants by thinking about what their height is at the end of their maturity, which usually takes about 2 to 3 years to get there. When do they bloom? How do they spread? This is a really important one, especially if you do have a small urban property and you want to kind of keep things a little bit tighter and neater. So first things, looking at existing conditions. So, most of us have mature street trees that are growing close, if not within our property boundaries. So you want to think about how that's affecting the area, the shade that it's providing. Do you have a really, turf grass doesn't grow there because of the dense shade from the Norway maple that's planted on the street, things like that. We want to look at how the existing conditions already are and how we can improve those with native plants. And you also want to think about the invasive species that might be present. We're all dealing with those. There's not really any way of fully getting rid of them. They're always going to be kind of present. But we want to think about how can we, get rid of most of them before we start planting natives to make it a little bit easier on yourself. Soil conditions is another condition of the property that you want to look into. Do you have clay soils? Do you have sandy soils? These are huge things that are going to influence what kind of plants will thrive and do well. And if you really want a specific plant, but you don't have the right soil conditions, if there's any amendments you want to do, but more often than not, there's always a plant for every soil type. So don't think you have to amend your soil in order to get native plants to grow on your property. And also thinking about that wet, damp quarter that, all the water drains to from your 3 other neighbors. What can we put in there that will absorb that water, transpire it, put it into the aquifer and let it infiltrate into the soil, versus that really sunny area in the front of the house that gets full sun all day. There's different locations that we can put different plants. And thinking about who do you want to attract? Do you want to attract, bees specifically? Then we might want to focus on different plants that we're putting in. If you want to do a monarch habitat, obviously there's a certain plants that we want to include in there, and not just milkweeds, but that's a key plant that we want to put in. So you want to look at, what we want to attract, and odds are you're going to attract more than what you just want to attract because there's other things out there that use the same plants. It's always important to have those host species. If any of you are aware of Doug Tallamy, he has a lot of great books out there talking about how we need to provide not only for the adult phase of insects, but also for their young. And it's not just about the pollinators. Those are the cool, pretty insects that are out there, but there's so much more wildlife that uses native plants and uses the habitat that we want to also provide for to complete that whole ecosystem and provide for different phases of each life cycle that animals go through, and also to keep some of those pests in check. You need to have some of those good guys to get rid of the bad ones. Another thing to think about too when you're selecting plants is, we think about things spatially on the ground floor, but we also want to think vertically. And this is where it comes into play with different heights of plants. You can go all the way to large canopy trees, but even just looking kind of in a smaller garden setting, you still want to have that varying of height, because then you can get more plants in and you're not limited to the number of species that you're using. So having those taller, mature canopy trees planted in your property, some shrubs and understory bushes, but then also the perennials and the ground covers. So we want to think about all those different heights and different things that are going on vertically as well as horizontally in the landscape. And then when you start thinking about your whole property as an ecosystem, this is where it gets really exciting for me, because you can start creating different habitats, different microclimates on your property, no matter what the size is. You know, the north side of your house is a different ecosystem than the south side of your house, just because of the different sunlight levels that are there, the different soil moisture and things like that. So it's really exciting. You can start to manipulate your property and get a lot of different species growing on your, say, quarter acre of a property, and it's the same amount of species that could be growing on a 10-acre property. And when we start to look at those different ecosystems and your neighbor starts to do it, that's when we start to piece everything together and we start to get a overall larger ecosystem, larger habitat for some of those bigger animals that we need more tracts of land to survive and to thrive. So when you have your neighbor also has a corner of their property that they have go wild and have shrubs and taller trees, and that connects to the neighbors, then you have twice as much space that birds and other animals can use and start to make that bigger habitat. So it's not just, well, my quarter acre can't support these animals, but when your neighbor's quarter acre and their neighbor's quarter acre, it starts to add up pretty quickly, and we start to create that continuity over the landscape. All right, so that was just a really quick overview of design and kind of how we want to think about things, but I really wanted to spend most of the time tonight talking about plant selection and specifically some plants that are really good for urban areas, those tough natives that can handle all those extreme climate conditions that we put them through. So first, we're going to talk about the different characteristics of the plants that we want to look at. Most of this is kind of personal preference. You know, not all animals, bees, birds, they don't all care so much about the colors. Plus, they don't even really see the same colors as we do, because they usually see in the ultraviolet spectrum a little bit more than our eyes are adapted to. But having that different color palette is what makes it attractive for your neighbor and people driving by. So we want to kind of, make it attractive for us, and in return, we're also making it appealing for different insects to come in. So, putting white flowers in a shady area, it helps brighten that up and make it more interesting to go visit and go explore. And then when we do colors that are complementary, then we can start to get those nice blends of different compatible colors in the landscape. And purple and yellow is kind of that really common one that we like to put together. And when you're talking about different pollinators that you're trying to attract, the flower structure and the shape of those flowers is really essential. So long-tongued bees and hummingbirds, they have those really long mouth parts, and so they like those tubular flowers, whereas butterflies, they like to have a landing place that they can sit on, like this red admiral and like purple coneflower. They like to have that landing place where they can fan their wings while they enjoy a little treat. So looking at the different plant flower structures, that will determine what species you're going after to attract to your yard. So if you really want hummingbirds in your property, having those nectar sources, those tubular flowers, is how you're going to get them to hang around more and having a lot of them. And also leaf texture. I mean, shady places are really hard to get flowers to bloom all year round, just because our native species, they bloom up really early in the spring, like right now. And then once that leaf canopy fills in, they're kind of tapped out for the year, but we also can have different leaf textures, and that makes it exciting and makes it interesting to go explore and look at, and keeping that dynamic flow through the space. So it's important in shady areas, but we can use it in other areas too, in the sunnier areas, because there's no flower, exotic or native, that will bloom all year round. So we want to look at those leaves and look beyond the blooms. And by adding an accent specimen, that's how we can, add some movement to the design and the space. And when I was talking about that going vertically, this is how we do that. So if you have a smaller area, maybe you don't want to put in another shade tree if you already have one, but having a taller perennial, such as some of these that I have listed here, that is how we can get that verticalness drawing your eye up. And it's also nice if you have a 2-story house to kind of bring that scale down to human level. And so it's not such an abrupt distance that you're changing vertically. So taller plants like prairie dock and rattlesnake master and Joe Pye weed, those are all really good tall perennials that hold their structure really well and can be good accents. And we can also think about the color too. That would be a good way to draw the eye to a space. Butterfly milkweed is just a showstopper of a plant that will bring everyone's eye to it when it's blooming. So it's a really good way to contrast the colors. Again, going back to that color selection, you can use that to make an accent piece. And equinoxes. So right now we're kind of in that first spring equinox still, where we are having everything emerge and waking up. And this, I feel, is a point that we kind of miss a lot in our design landscape with plant selection, is we don't think about those early spring blooming flowers in our urban landscapes, or those really late ones. We're kind of focused on just in the middle when we're outside the most during the summertime. But those springtime blooms, those are so essential for emerging queen bees that are coming out and migrating birds that are going to be coming through. So we want to make sure we have species that are in bloom during those times so that we're supporting all wildlife throughout the whole year. And then the same thing happens in the fall too. We want to have things that are blooming from September and even into October, because there's still some of those migrating birds and dragonflies and butterflies that are moving south. So we want to make sure that they have a place to stop over and rest and replenish their energy supplies as they keep moving on. So we want to, expand our bloom time and our growing season by keeping some of those early spring flowers and those late flowering plants as well. And that kind of goes into seasonality. We want something going on every time of year. We want something that we can look at, whether that's, the seed heads, the berries in the fall, or the fall color. And fall color doesn't stop with the sugar maples. There's a lot of different trees that have great fall color, but even some of our perennial species, you start to get some of those different different colors in their leaves as the chlorophyll starts to leave. So we start getting those reds and those oranges as the green is starting to leave the plant as it's going dormant. So we want to have something going on at least with one species throughout the whole year. And winter interest is another thing too. Winter is long in Wisconsin. Every year we always have to go through multiple months of browns and snow and everything. So it's nice to have different seed heads out there that we can look at, that the birds are attracted to too, and as they go rummaging through for seeds, leaving things standing up so they have a place to overwinter and a place to look for plants and look for food. So let's take a step back. I know that's a lot of information. And again, I kind of wanted to breeze through that so we could focus a little bit more on individual plants that we want to look at for a good selection. So let's just kind of take a deep breath and put that stuff aside that we just looked at, because in reality, diversity is the answer. So if you don't want to sit down and spend hours going through booklets and magazines looking for different plants from different nurseries, diversity is the biggest thing. As long as you're planting a good diversity of different species, you're going to hit all those things that I just talked about. You're going to have different flower structure. You're going to have something blooming early in the year and something late in the year. So you don't have to stress out so much about the different selection, as long as you're doing a good selection of species. More often than that, you're going to hit most of those key points we all already talked about. So let's get into some of these must-have species that we find for native plants and that work well in small urban areas. One tree that we could do as an accent that's a nice mid-story tree, so it doesn't get to be a huge canopy, is going to be the serviceberry. And there's a couple different cultivars that you can also do of this one if you want it to be more of a single stem tree specimen or a multi-stem or shrub-like You can get different things like that, but it's a really great tree. It's really urban tolerant. It can handle clay soils. It has really nice fall color and really beautiful blooms that should be opening up pretty soon. There's a couple specimens that I have in my neighborhood that are getting close to opening up. And the berries are also edible. So just all around, it's a really great tree. Edible to humans and to birds. They love them. You're going to have to fight them for them, but it's just a really great tree that you can have in your yard, and it stays small, so you can have it a little bit closer to the house if you wanted to, or have it as an accent in an island bed that's further from the house. Another really great one is the pagoda dogwood. This one has a really nice horizontal structure with the different layers of the branching that it gets, and it gets covered in these gorgeous white flowers in the spring, and then it also gets berries, the little brown or bluish purple color, and the bluebirds and robins, thrushes, those kind of birds just love these berries, and will strip a bush clean in a matter of days when they're ripe. So it's really nice, and it gets really nice structure that you can see in the winter when all the leaves have fallen off. You get those nice horizontal branches that the snow can collect on, and it's just a nice specimen tree as well. It gets a little bit wider than the serviceberry. The serviceberry is more of an upright vase-shaped shrub, whereas the pagoda dogwood is a little bit more of kind of a ball-shaped, very oval and round. And then going down on a little bit of a smaller scale is the American hazelnut. This one I really love because it blooms really early in the spring, gets these nice catkins that hang down, and then if you see in the picture with my hand, there's a little tiny flower, and that's what's going to produce those hazelnuts in the fall. Again, gets really great fall color, and it has a really nice base structure similar to the serviceberry. It's a really nice hedge species. So if you want to block that neighbor's view, or keep that privacy in the backyard or along the side yard, this is a really good specimen that you can put a couple of them, and you get this really nice fall color and then a really nice screen throughout the whole year. So then moving into more of the perennials, this is kind of where the most of my talk is going to focus on. We have different perennials. These are those accent ones. So like I said, they're taller. They're going to be more of a specimen plant. Maybe you're planting only one or two in your yard, and they kind of act as that transition from the shrub canopy layer into more of the herbaceous, the ground layer that's at our level. So Joe Pye weed is a really great one. There's a couple different species in it. So there's one that likes to be in the sunny and wet areas, whereas there's another one that's a woodland species that can handle some shade. Both of them are really good. I like to go with the shade one more often because it is a little bit shorter, but they both have really good structure. They stay standing on their own even though they are taller. They don't get as floppy as, say, ironweed. So this is a really nice alternative to that. If you have a drier area, rattlesnake master is a really cool plant that has some nice architectural features with the cylindrical or the globe-shaped flowers on top. Really nice, interesting plant that's definitely gonna turn some heads as people walk past your property. And if you really want to turn some heads, prairie dock is the next one that I really like to use. It's one of the few silphiums that I will put into designs because it doesn't seem to spread as aggressively by seed, whereas cup plant is going to spread by seed and rhizome pretty easily. So prairie dock is a really nice one, gets these really great big leaves at the base, and it sends up a super tall stalk late in the summer into fall. And if you want to attract birds, this is another must-have because the goldfinches and other finches are just going to go crazy when that plant is done flowering and gone to seed. And while it is flowering, the bees are just all over it. So it's a really nice accent specimen. Again, maybe you're only going to put one or two in your property, but it's still really great to have. And then looking at some different soil types. So we have dry soil. And like I said, those areas where they are the south facing of the house, that's going to be your driest area. These are some really great plants that you can put in there. Another thing with having tough soils in urban soils, having a nitrogen fixer. So any of our legume species are really nice. This is one, the cream indigo, likes to be a little bit drier and seems to be a little bit more deer resistant and bunny resistant than other legume species. So that's one nice one that I like to have. It stays nice and short, only about 2 feet tall. Really nice mounding habit with these gorgeous cream colored flowers. And then columbine is a really good plant for pretty much any area. It likes shade, it likes sunny, it likes dry areas. It can also handle a little bit of moisture, but tends to be on the drier side. So this is one that you could put anywhere. You could put it in a woodland garden, or you could put it next to the house on those dry facing sides. And then sedges is another one. The Bicknell sedge here is another great one. It's a good alternative for maybe some of those dry, shadier areas. Sedges do a lot better in shade than our grasses do. So it's a nice clump forming grass that can fill in between your perennials and kind of keep everybody in line and keep things standing upright. So it's a really good alternative there. And moving to some wet conditions, again, another sedge, brown fox sedge, is a really good one for wetland areas that, you know, water may even stay standing. So if you have a rain garden area and full sun, brown fox sedge is a good one to put in. Jacob's ladder is another good one where it can handle drier areas if there's gets a little bit of shade. So if you have a wet area and has full sun, it'll do well there, or if it gets some shade and you can put it into a drier area. It just doesn't like to get totally dried out in those hot summer months. Another really good early spring flowering one that the bees, as they emerge, they can go to and get their nectar and pollen. And then another grass here that I have that handles wetter conditions, and this one can go in sun or shade, is the northern sea oats. I will warn, this one is a really great plant and really attractive, but it does seed itself pretty easily. So I would say start with a few if you wanted to go with that, but it gives a really nice backdrop. So if you have some shorter perennials in front and have this in the background, it gives a really nice contrast to them, and the seed heads in the fall and then into the winter, they stay on and have a nice accent piece. So it's a really nice grass. And then when we want to go back to some of the colors that we can look at, these are some nice striking colors. The spiderwort is really great because it blooms pretty regularly throughout the season, from early May, June, all the way later into the fall. It'll actually kind of get a second growth of flowers. So it's a really nice one, really bright blue colors. It doesn't have any nectar source, but it is a good source of pollen for those bumblebees. So I have it in my yard, and those queen bees just go crazy for it, collecting that pollen in the early spring. And then thinking too, this red baneberry is an example where we don't have to focus on just the flower color, but the color of the berries. So the baneberry has a white flower in the spring, but then it gets this bright red berries in the fall. So then you start to see that different transition, that seasonality that I mentioned earlier too, and you get different colors from the same plant, which is awesome. And then looking into the fall, one of those late plants that we want to have for migrating insects is going to be our asters. And the sky blue aster is a really nice one. It stays short. I like it because it's nice and airy. It's not so dense. So it's a really good one that you can plant in amongst other things. And then you get these nice pops of light purple lavender color flowers in the fall. It can seed itself a little bit, but it's not as bad as, say, the New England aster or some of the other asters that are in the native plant selection. So I think if you wanted to have an aster, this is a really good alternative to have that's, you know, a little bit safer for those smaller urban areas, but you still get the benefit of that late season bloom time. And then looking at kind of making a border along your flower beds or along a sidewalk or driveway, things like that. These are really good species that can handle those salt and those hot conditions. So bush honeysuckle is our native honeysuckle, and it only gets to be about 3 feet tall at max, maybe a little bit taller if it gets full sun. And it's able to be sheared really nicely if you wanted to do that, but you can also leave it natural. And the leaf color gets a nice red for the new growth and has these nice tubular yellow flowers that hummingbirds will actually go to along with other insects. Just a really nice mounding shrub. It can sucker a little bit, and that's why I like to use it as a hedge species, because you can start replacing like boxwoods or something like that. You can plant these and kind of get that same effect, but it's with a native plant. And it's also a larval host for our clear wing moths. So if you've ever seen those are those big moths during the day that look like little hummingbirds, but they're actually a moth. So this is our larvae host for them. So you will see the caterpillars feeding on them, and then they'll overwinter as pupa in the soil, and then they'll emerge in the spring as the clear wing moth. So another bonus on this one is that it has that larval host capability. Prairie dropseed is used a lot, and for good reason. It's a really nice, compact grass that gets a nice mound. It has really fragrant flowers for a grass species. You can really smell them when they're in bloom during the late summer months. Some people say it smells like popcorn. I don't really quite get that smell, but everybody has a little different taste. So really nice one. What else can I say about that? Oh, and then also the clump, the fact that it's a clumping grass. You'll get bumblebees will nest in it sometimes. Birds will use that dry grass the next year to help build their nests. So it's a really nice overall plant that has a lot of different benefits, even though it's not a flower or nectar source per se. And then nodding onion is another great salt tolerant plant that stays short. It can seed itself. And some of these, when I say that it sells seeds, usually it's not overtaking the area, but it can, start to spread and fill in those spaces in between other plants. And one easy way to get around that is just to cut those seed heads off in the fall. Either transplant them into a different area that you want to use them and have plants come in that area in the next year, or just, you can compost them or toss them. And that's a good way, you still get the benefit during the summer, but you don't get them spreading all over the place. And then looking at some ground covers, talking about those weedy issues, having green mulch, and what that is you just have a plant that's growing in amongst all the other plants that you have, and it prevents there from being that open area for weed seeds or other, seeds from the native plants as well, germinating. We don't want, if we leave those 2-foot gaps in between plants, that's where we start to get weed issues. So if we have a ground cover that can fill in and move around in between those different areas, then we reduce the opportunity for weeds to come in and infest that area. So these are some really good ones for shady areas. They like to be a little bit on the drier side, so if you have a really wet, shady area, we might want to look at different plant options, but these are really good ones for those shady areas that are drier. Big leaf aster, again, one of those aster species that's going to be blooming later in the season. Stays nice and short, has these really attractive big leaves, obviously because it's called big leaf aster, that I like to substitute this one for people like hostas. Similar with the wild ginger. Those are two that I substitute because so many people use hostas in the shade gardens. So these are good native alternatives that we can put in. And then the wild geranium is a really nice one that blooms in May. And if you have, just a carpet of them in a shady area, it's just a gorgeous sight to see them all in bloom at the same time. The flowers themselves don't last very long, but they do send up a lot of flowers. So you'll get a good bloom time off of that. And it's, a nice spot for bees to get away from the rain or spend the night in. I've seen bees, curled up in those flowers in the early springtime. So really good nectar plant for those early emerging bee species. And then all of our sedges are really good green mulch, but Pennsylvania sedge is one of them that spreads a little bit faster. So you can, plant one and then it'll spread by rhizomes in amongst all the other plants and just gets this nice kind of a floppy appearance, even though it's only a foot, gets maybe a foot tall. So it's a really good alternative too if you wanted to do like a Nomo area instead of using those Nomo fescue blends that they have out there. You can actually use a true native species using the Pennsylvania sedge, and you can mix it in with different sedges. Bicknell sedge would be another good one too, and Plains oval sedge that you could mix those in to the different areas and have that nice diversity. And then going into the sunny areas, so we want to kind of do the same thing. We can do that with wild strawberry. That's one that's universal too. You can do that in a shady area as well. It will be a little bit more aggressive when it's in full sun and happy, so it spreads by the runners. This is one that I would say I would start with a few and then let them, spread out, and you can transplant the runners off of them and use them in different areas and let them fill in. If you want one that is also a larval host, we have world milkweed. It's one of our shorter milkweeds that likes dry, sunny areas that will fill in and kind of spread in amongst all the other plants. Gets these really cool, skinny seeds, seed pods on the top that turn a nice, some of them turn reddish in the fall. So a really nice accent piece as well throughout the season. And then another one, I think the wild petunia is also a larval host. I'm not quite sure on what butterfly it is, but it's a really nice low ground cover that spreads out from one plant. You can get about 3 feet wide with one plant. So as it gets older, it'll fill in and spread that way. Really nice, bright lavender flowers again. They're kind of similar to the wild geraniums where the flowers don't last long, but it sends out a lot of different flowers throughout the year. And it's also a good species for like rock gardens or along the edge, a nice transition down to maybe a grass area if you have. So right along the edge of the bed would be a really good spot for the wild petunia. And then kind of going back to all the larval hosts here, a few more. So the black swallowtail uses anything in the carrot family. So we have the golden Alexander, again, a really good universal plant. It kind of pretty much grows anywhere. It will self-seed. So I tell people to kind of start with just a few and see how it does. And when I say, self-seed doesn't mean it's going to self-seed in everyone's property, but if you have really favorable conditions and it's happy, it's one that can pop up in different areas. But again, more golden Alexander just means more black swallowtails, and I don't think that that's a problem. So that one can go in sun or shade, and it does like wetter conditions too. So if you have a wetland rain garden, something like that by the downspout, this would be a good one there. Also, the turtlehead is another wetland plant that you can put in that would be good for by the downspout or in that area of your property that stays wet for most of the year. And it's a larval host for the Baltimore checker spot. So a nice one there. And I already kind of mentioned the butterfly milkweed. This is kind of one of my favorite milkweeds to use because it does stay short and has that bright yellow or orange color, and it's just such a showstopper when it's in bloom. This one can also even be used as kind of like a small shrub because it can get a little woody in appearance, and just kind of stands out as that accent piece like I mentioned earlier. Some people have had issues with this one growing in clay. I haven't seen that, so it might be one that is a little hit or miss depending on how wet your property is. So if you do have a wetter site, I would definitely stick this one in closer to the house where it stays a little bit drier and sunny, so that it can thrive and do well there. And then coming back to talk a little bit more about those equinoxes, these are some good early spring and then fall flowering plants. So like right now, the bloodroot are blooming like crazy. So I was just out in my yard today watching all the little mining bees and cellophane bees going at them. So right now we have things that are in bloom, and we gotta support those native bees that are coming out and looking for that early meal. Prairie smoke is another one, and that's a good one too. That's also salt tolerant. So if you have a space next to a sidewalk or a driveway that you want to keep something low, but also provide habitat and a pollen source, you can use the prairie smoke. And I don't have a picture of it, but once it gets pollinated by bumblebees, the flower will flop up and lift up, and then you'll have the smoke of the seed head. So it has that seasonality change too in it, where it looks completely different once it's done being pollinated. And any of our Liatris species are blazing stars, things like those. We have species for pretty much every type of soil except for shade. I don't think there's a Liatris that does very well in shady areas, but if you have part sun, you can get a Liatris species to bloom in your property. And the monarchs just flock to this plant in the fall when they're doing their migration heading south. It's a really great nectar source. And bees and everybody else will use it too, but if you want to have monarchs, milkweed and Liatris, those are the two species that I always tell people to have in their property, because that will support both their adult phase and their larval phase. And then zigzag goldenrod. Most of our goldenrod species are a little too aggressive for in an smaller area, and so I try to use the shadier ones. So zigzag goldenrod or elm leaf goldenrod are two really good ones that stay relatively short, 2 to 3 feet tall, and do well in shady areas. So where you don't typically think of a goldenrod doing well, these guys will do just fine in those areas. Oops. And as you can see in this picture, there's a little bee that's over one of the male bumblebees in the fall that is taking a snooze underneath there because they don't go back to the hive. So having that, flower source, he can wake up in the morning when it's warm enough for him to fly around, and he has a breakfast space right there for him. So it's really nice to have those late season flowering species. And then talking a little bit, we talked about green mulch, but annual maintenance. So many people think, oh, native plantings are a lot of work. You have to know what everything is and all the work that it goes into weeding it. But honestly, if you do the maintenance, do the work the first year or two, they really are self-sufficient. And you may have to go through and check for invasive species and things like that as it matures and as it grows throughout your property. But leaving it kind of messy is good for the plants and also good for our insects and our pollinators, because then we leave an overwintering spot for them. They can curl up in those leaves or go into the stems and overwinter there and survive our harsh conditions. And it also gives us something to look at. We have, if you cut everything down in the fall, what are you going to watch for in the winter when you're stuck at home and it's snowing out? Once you want to see, occasional bird fly through, picking through, trying to find those seeds during the winter months. So kind of the messy garden is a healthy garden. Okay, so those are kind of the overall plants that I think are some of the toughest ones and the easiest ones that we can do. Not to say those are the only ones. So I had a hard time narrowing it down to those. So I will say there's so many other great native plants, and not to say that you're limited to these ones that I talked about today, but this is just a start and a place to get you going. So how do we execute this plan? We've picked out the plants, and now how do we make it happen? So when you're transitioning into a native landscape, or kind of any landscape, you want to start small. It's not good to take on more than you can handle, because then you start to get overwhelmed, you start to fall behind, especially if your neighbors don't take care of their property with invasives and things like that. You start small, get something established and get it healthy, and then you can keep expanding it as the years go on. So doing a phasing plan is definitely the way to go. I work with a lot of clients and we phase the design in over multiple years, and that way they're able to start identifying the plants on their own because they've been working in a smaller area where they only had 5 species to remember, and then we expand the next year and add another 5. Always start with your trees and shrubs too. Those are the plants that are going to take the longest to get established, so we want to get those in the ground first. And starting small with those is more economical, it's more physically possible. So if we can start with some smaller ones, let them grow into the space, and then fill in around them with our perennials and other plants. And shop local, and that's really important with native species, especially if you want things to be low maintenance as possible. Using Midwest ecotypes is really important because they've survived in our climate for millennia, and so they have adapted to the climate conditions that we have here in Wisconsin. So if you can't get Wisconsin specifically native plants, you can at least go to the Midwest, and they should still do pretty well. And don't go to those big box stores. We don't know what they're doing with their plants. It's starting to get better with their treatment of them with herbicides or insecticides and things like that. But I still, I tell people to shy away from doing that. There's so many good native nurseries that are coming up that we can use those and know that they're treating things properly. And then I just kind of wanted to touch real quickly on nativars. There's still a lot of science being done on these, so we don't really know if one's better than the other. I try to stick with doing true native species, but where I start to draw the line, we can use cultivars. We don't have to use true species, especially if they look very similar. Like a lot of our nativars are cultivated so that they stay shorter in stature or they bloom a little bit longer. And that's okay, as long as the flower stays the same. So looking at the Summer Beauty allium versus the Nodding Onion. So these are both the same species, but the Summer Beauty is a cultivar. So those look pretty similar to us. There might be something that maybe a bee sees that we don't see. But when you go over to the one on the right, the bloodroot, those two look completely different. So if you can imagine, you're this tired little bee that just woke up from how many months, 3 or 4 months of overwintering, and you're looking for that first meal, and you see this flower with 50 times more petals than what you're used to, you're not going to know where those stamen are for that pollen. So that's where we really need to be careful on our nativars and using those instead of the true native species. And again, remember, no property is too small to bring in natives. Even if you just do a few species, you're still going to make a huge difference. And even, your practices, not cleaning up everything super tidy at the end of the season, leaving things standing over winter. Those are other things that you can do and provide habitat for insects and pollinators over the winter. And so I just wanted to really go through some examples of some projects that I've worked on that have been small properties. This one I just put in there. Even though plants say that they get to a certain height, it's not always true. So this is a stiff goldenrod that if you look at it in a brochure or magazine, it'll say it's only supposed to get maybe 3 feet tall. Well, this one was easily over 6, maybe 7, pushing 8 feet tall. So that's one thing that we struggle with some of our native species is they do well in such poor, crappy soils that when we put them into healthy soils, they just take it full advantage. Luckily, this client didn't really care. They were there for putting plants in to provide habitat and nectar sources, so they're fine with it. But I could see, some people being a little deterred by native species when they act like this. So that's why there's some species that I typically stay away from, especially if we want more of a manicured type landscape. But we can still use those other natives that we mentioned earlier. This is a nice compilation of a shadier garden. We have different sedges in here and also the bloodroot leaves. And so just having those different textures just makes it so much more dynamic and so much more interesting to look at than if we just had a bed of Pachysandra in this area. So having those different diversity, and having diversity is also really beneficial too, because we don't always know if everything is going to survive, even no matter how much we plan. We still have plants that are just not feeling it. They don't want to grow in that space. So if you have a good diversity, odds are something is going to grow, and then it's going to do well there and fill that niche. So having that good diversity, that good mix of plants is always beneficial and better in the long term. And this one is an example of just a small, front bed landscape between the house and the sidewalk. And we used green mulch of the wild strawberry that filled in around the prairie dropseed. And there's milkweed, butterfly milkweed, and also I think that's Sullivan's milkweed behind it. There's Joe Pye weed in here, there's columbine in here, so there's just a lot going on in this small space, and it's just loaded with butterflies and bees all summer long. So again, no property is too small to make an impact. And then I just threw this one in here. This is the same rain garden, just two different sides of it. So we have the tall Joe Pye weed in the middle, and then on one side we have some smaller perennials, the Canada anemone on the left, and I think there might be some turtle head in there too. And then the other side on the right, we used brown fox sedge. So there's two different ways of bringing that tall specimen plant down to the grass level and, you know, making that cascading effect. And so you can do it with either more other flowering plants, or you can do it with grasses and sedges. And then I just threw a couple different resources here, some books that I've read that I've recommended to clients that are just really great ways to start getting you really super excited about using native plants and what you can achieve with them, and also the importance of them and why we need to start using native plants more in every landscape, not just urban or suburban or rural. Every landscape needs to have native plants. And like our friend the Lorax said, unless someone like you cares a whole lot, nothing's going to get better. It's just not. So I hope you guys all enjoy this presentation and learn something, and that we can, you know, get those orders into the plant sale and get planting this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. So we have a few questions, and folks, if you didn't type in your question, we would love to see more questions, but I'll start with what people have already sent in. Okay, so do you have ideas for deer resistant plants?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I would say I have a better list of what to kind of stay away from. Deer will really eat anything. But I would say, you know, staying away from like doing your different clovers and stuff. They really like purple prairie clover. They really go after. Bunnies do too. The biggest thing with deer, I think, is just doing multiple species. So having that diversity again, so that, you know, they don't have the one plant that you planted and they love it and it's all gone. So having that diversity, planting sedges and different grasses in surprisingly does help a lot, and having that more mosaic type of a landscape versus having, you know, 6 plants here, 6 plants here, 6 plants here, like making them work for it. That's how you can hide in some of those plants that they really love. But yeah, it's hard with deer, and it's just something that you just need to, you know, kind of experiment with, because, you know, what your deer like, my deer may not like. So having that diversity too is a way to kind of experiment and see which ones they stay away from.
Thanks. Purple squill exploded this year. Lots of little pollinators flying around, but they don't seem to alight. Is squill a good plant for insects?
I don't know too much about it. I'm guessing it probably does provide some sort of nectar source. But again, it's displacing our native ones. And so the bees may not know what it is, or, you know that it provides them anything. So I think they do use it because it's there and it's their only choice. But if they had one to go to, they would probably go towards a bloodroot versus the squill. I know people like to keep it in their yard because it's something other than grass and it looks pretty in the spring, but in woodlands, it can really take over and just knock out so many of our early spring ephemerals. So yeah, it's not one to use as alternative to natives. I would definitely try to get rid of it, but it is a hard one to deal with.
Thanks. My wild geranium seems to take over. Are they invasive?
So it's one of those that they will actually shoot their seeds when they mature. So if you've ever looked at them, when the seed head dries out, it actually like throws the seed around. So they can take over. However, it's still a native species and still providing that habitat. And that's why I like to use it as a ground cover, because it does fill in those areas. So if you if you wanted to reduce its population, you know, the best way to prevent things from spreading too much, especially by seed, is to fill in those gaps with a green mulch, like I mentioned earlier. But yeah, I mean, I have a hard time saying it's not invasive. It's just that it's opportunistic, that there's a space that it can fill, so it's going to. And the best way to kind of combat that is to plant something else in there. So putting in some columbine or some bloodroot, some of the sedges, things like that. You can kind of keep it in check a little bit more and fill in with other plants.
Sounds good. What is too early for spring cleanup?
So the kind of standard is keeping, if we have like a week worth of 50-degree weather. So right now we've kind of had an early spring. We've had some pretty warm days. Bees are out and about. So I actually cleaned up my yard this past weekend. And when I clean up, all I'm doing is I'm cutting everything down to about knee high. And so if you remember one of the pictures I had, these stalks, I leave those up to be about knee high and just cut everything down from that, because the birds have already picked through, the seeds have already dropped. Those stalks are kind of, you know, the top half of them are kind of no longer needed, and then I compost them. But those stalks, by leaving them up about a foot, we're providing habitat for those solitary bees to go in and lay their eggs and their nest in those stalks. So you know, those are happening right now. Usually if you don't want to like keep track of the temperature days and things like that, as long as you're seeing things out flying around, that's usually a good sign that you can start cleaning up. Again, I wouldn't like get all the leaves out of your bed or anything like that, because they still go and they protect themselves, because we're still going to probably get snow. I hate to say that, but we're not out of the clear yet. So leaving that leaf litter and some of those stalks, that provides a space that those insects can go and hide if we do get a cold snap, and they can protect themselves that way, and they're not, you know, vulnerable out in the wide open.
How much adjusting have you done with native plants you use as climate change continues?
That's a good question. I haven't done too much, just because these plants are so resilient that I think they're going to be able to adjust. I know a lot of people are planting, especially like tree species, planting more southern tree species into Wisconsin and further north, so that we have some sort of canopy. And I think that's important. Because, you know, we don't want to lose, just like with all the ash trees, we don't want to lose some of our species so abruptly, where we don't have the canopy to protect the understory. So I do plant a few woody plants that might be more southern species, but I still try to stick with Midwest. So going south into, you know, Tennessee and areas like that, that's probably the lowest I would go, bringing those plants up here, because, you know, we want to help a little bit, but we don't really know, unfortunately, how climate change is going to affect plants. And I like to kind of just let things work themselves out and try to put my efforts other ways to reduce our effects of climate change, and push people to do that versus moving these plants, because we've already found out that moving plants around has some negative impacts on our local ecotypes.
What would you plant beneath a dying swamp oak tree?
Another oak tree. Under a dying oak tree, swamp oak. You could do a lot under there. I mean, oak trees are really nice because they do have a somewhat open canopy, so they have some of those sunnier, you're able to put some of those sunnier or perennials underneath it. I would start going towards more sunny things, some of those edge savanna species, or species like columbine or geranium, where they can tolerate some sun and some shade. Golden Alexander would be another good one. I would stay away from like your deep shade species. Solomon seal, that would be another good one that you could put under there if it's not there already. If you wanted to do more perennials, that bush honeysuckle would be a good one that would stay shorter, that you could put underneath there. But you could do a lot of different things under there as it fades to more sun-loving plants.
Nice. Someone said that they have pruned swamp milkweed to control height. Will this work for ironweed and goldenrod?
I have heard people doing that. So you prune it back, once it starts growing, and in like June or so. I wouldn't do it any later than June, but in June you can cut them back to half the height, and then they'll send up new sprouts and still flower. You can do that if you already have them in the landscape. That's why I try to keep people away from putting some of those taller plants in, just for the fact that that's extra maintenance that you have to do. So if we would have could put in a smaller plant, like maybe let's do that first. But if it's already in your yard, and those are really great plants for pollinators, so I'm not saying that they're terrible plants and you need to get rid of them, but you can do that with a lot of those taller species. You can prune them back in early summer, and then they'll re-sprout from the cut stalks, and they'll stay a little bit shorter then throughout the whole year and still bloom.
So now we have a follow-up question of how do you have advice on how to get rid of purple squill?
Diligence, and they have like a little tiny bulb. So if you have like a knife or a dandelion pruner, or not pruner, dandelion tool that you use to get that taproot out, those are really good ways to get rid of it. If there's not too heavy of an infestation. If you have a decent infestation of it, you could just use a shovel, and I would just start going to town and digging it up. Start with those few species that might be floating out further away, or individuals, and then move closer to the epicenter of it. You can also do an herbicide if you really wanted to, but I think if you got like a dandelion tool and just started popping them out, and loosening the soil around them, then you can get that bulb out of there. But if you're just pulling the leaves off, that bulb is still down there and it's not going to do anything. They'll be back.
And last question is, do you have experience with jumping worms? My yard recently is infested with them, and it doesn't hold moisture and nutrients anymore. Have you found any natives that can thrive even with these worms?
I haven't had too much experience, thankfully, with jumping worms. Native plants can do really well without those nutrients. I would try maybe getting in a nitrogen fixer. So the clovers, the bush clover, the prairie purple clover, the indigos, anything like that, because they'll start fixing that nitrogen and start, creating its own nutrients for other plants to use. I would do like rock garden type species too. So that wild petunia, columbine, things like that, those plants can grow on rocks. So they really can thrive in some really harsh conditions. And so I think you might have some success with them if you have the sunlight. If you don't have sunlight, then we get a little bit tougher conditions. But I would try some of those, some sedges too. A lot of native plants, they don't need those extra nutrients. So hopefully, we'll be able to get some good natives in there and start to see some improvement, because they're not going away either, the jumping worms. And I think it's gonna be a huge problem once they get really a foothold in the ground. So yeah.
Yeah, I know a lot of folks who are struggling with that in Port Washington area.
Yeah.
So that's the questions, other than Melissa is thanking you for the advice. And I would like to thank you one more time, Danielle, for coming and presenting to us as part of the series.
Thank you. Yeah. And I have my email. I think that was also in the blurb from the emails that Jen sent out. So feel free to email me any questions if you guys have, or you think of later in the week, or as you're planning your native gardens. So good luck, everyone, and thank you for attending.